He trained where no one cared to look in a park that had been left to rot, where the swings groaned, the benches peeled, and the cracked pavement became his ring. His shoes were split, his gloves scavenged, his body thin from hunger. Yet every morning he returned, fists raised against ghosts only he could see. No coach, no crowd, just pain, repetition, and the refusal to quit. But one day, when he thought he was truly alone, a shadow stepped from the edges of the court and everything he believed about his fight was about to change. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The park had been forgotten by almost everyone who once cared for it. The paint on the benches peeled in long strips. The basketball court's lines were faded until they were nothing more than memories, and the swings hung crooked on chains that groaned when the wind moved them. But in the far corner, where the pavement had cracked into uneven slabs, a boy stood with his fists raised. He was alone, though his body moved as if someone unseen stood in front of him, testing him, pressing. Him, his sneakers too thin for the pounding he gave them, scraped across the ground, soles frayed until the rubber bent upward at the edges. He did not stop to think about how worn they looked. They were all he had, and they would last as long as he made them. His fists cut through the air, the sound sharp and hollow against the morning stillness. There was no bag to strike, no mitts catching the rhythm, just the sting of skin against skin as his knuckles slapped into his own open palm when he needed the impact. Sometimes he wrapped rags around them, cloth torn from shirts too small to wear, tying them tight enough to hold until the sweat soaked through. His hands bore the marks of that makeshift armor. Red abrasions that never seemed to heal, raw lines across his knuckles that split open again whenever he worked too long. He did not seem to mind. Every time the sting shot up his wrist, he answered. With another punch, the boy's breath filled the silence of the park. Heavy exhalations through clenched teeth, the kind of sound fighters make to remind themselves to keep their lungs alive while their arms burn. He was thin, narrower than most kids his age. But there was something in the way his shoulders twisted with each throw, the way his hips turned and his heels lifted, that gave the movement weight beyond his size. He wasn't wild. Not anymore. At first, his swings had been nothing more than flailing, the way anyone might throw when they wanted to feel strong without knowing how, but repetition had shaped him. His form wasn't correct by any trainer's measure, but it was tighter, closer to something real, born out of hours when no one watched and no one corrected. A stray dog barked at the edge of the park, startling a cluster of pigeons into flight. The boy didn't look up. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, locked on the ghost of an opponent. Only he could see. He bobbed left, shoulders rolling, fists darting out in 3s, 4s, 5s. As if he had memorized combinations he had once glimpsed on a screen and kept replaying in his mind. When his legs shifted across the cracked concrete, dust lifted into the air. The rhythm of his movement was imperfect but relentless, the kind of rhythm that said he had no one to impress but himself. The cold bit through the fabric of his hoodie. The cuffs frayed so badly that threads dangled loose with each punch. Had already soaked the collar, despite the chill, forming a dark patch that clung to his neck. He would pause only 4 seconds at a time, shaking out his hands, rolling his wrists, before pulling his fists back to his chin. Even when his arms trembled, even when his breath turned ragged, he returned to the stance. The stance mattered more than anything. It was the difference between a boy swinging at shadows and a fighter waiting for a bell that might never ring. Every sound carried further in the emptiness. The slap of his shoes against the pavement, the snap of his exhale, the faint grunt when a punch landed right. None of it echoed back. The buildings nearby were too far, and no one was close enough to hear. It was a private performance that had no audience, and yet he carried it with the seriousness of a match. To him, the cracked pavement wasn't ruin. It was the ring he had been given, and he filled it with every ounce of himself. He trained until his arms ached so badly he couldn't lift them above his chest. Only then would he stop, letting them dangle loose while he paced the small circle he had carved into the ground with his movement. He pressed his knuckles into his thighs, feeling the raw sting flare up again, reminding him of what he had done, of what he had built from nothing. He lifted his eyes once, scanning the park. No one watched. No one cared. That perhaps was why he worked so hard. If no one else would give him proof, he would make his own. The sun broke weakly through a bank of clouds, spilling thin light across the cracked pavement. He raised his fists again, shoulders squaring. His body swayed lightly, a rhythm ingrained deeper than hunger or fatigue. Alone, unseen, with shoes that should have given out long ago, and hands that would never be mistaken for protected, he threw another punch. Then another, then another. Each one carried the same message, silent but steady. He wasn't done yet. He would never be done. Nights were his classroom, and the glow of a cracked phone screen was the only teacher he could afford. He sat cross-legged, on the park bench, or sometimes against the rusted fence. The screen held close enough to his face that the fractured glass cut each movement into shards. The battery never lasted long, but when it did, he used every second. His thumb tapped, paused, rewound, played again. A single punch slowed to half speed, the way a legend shifted his weight from heel to toe, the twist of a shoulder that made the strike snap like lightning. He replayed those fragments endlessly, as if by staring hard enough he could carve them into his own body. The phone was old, long past what anyone else would carry proudly. The back cover was taped in place with strips of black electrical tape. A jagged crack ran diagonally across the screen, splitting faces into distorted halves. When the light hit it a certain way, one fighter's head looked doubled, like a ghost sparring beside him. But the boy didn't care about clarity, cared about motion, about the small details hidden in the rhythm of fists and feet. To him, the blurry picture still contained secrets worth chasing. He would watch the same fight 10, 20 times. Not for the outcome, but for the way it was built. Champions he had never met but knew by heart, the snap of Ali's jab, the rhythm of Tyson's hooks, the patience of Mayweather's defense. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, mimicking every step. His sneakers scuffed against the pavement. When he tried to match the bounce of a prime fighter's stance, he'd freeze the frame on a hook mid-swing, then rise to his feet and trace the arc with his own arm, adjusting again and again until it felt right. The phone became a mirror that reflected not his face, but the version of himself he wanted to be. The crack in the glass forced him to watch differently. Sometimes an opponent's punch disappeared under the broken line, forcing him to imagine the angle rather than see it clearly. He filled in the missing pieces with instinct, letting his body decide what the camera couldn't show. His imagination became part of the training, a silent coach filling gaps that no mentor stood nearby to explain. There was no one to correct him when his foot slid too far forward, no voice reminding him to keep his chin tucked. Every mistake lived and died in the dark, corrected only by his own stubborn observation. He learned to see himself through the fighter on the screen, measuring whether his shoulders dipped at the right time, whether his fists returned to guard. Fast enough. When he caught himself failing, he started again. He would not move on until the combination looked close enough to the one replaying on his phone. The glow of the screen cast a faint light on his face, the shadows beneath his eyes, deepened from nights spent awake long after the world around him slept. The cold made his fingers stiff, but still he tapped the screen, coaxing one more replay from the lagging device. Each time the phone froze, he exhaled sharply, waiting for it to return to motion. He hated interruptions. Boxing, even in this fragmented form, demanded continuity. He had none in life, but here in the crackling stream of old matches, he found it. Sometimes the volume was too low to hear clearly, muffled by the broken speaker, but he didn't need commentary.
Oh.
The rhythm of gloves against flesh was enough.
Oh.
The dull thud of a body shot, the crisp snap of a jab, he filled his ears with those sounds until they bled into his own imagination. He whispered counts under his breath, sinking his breath to theirs. 1, 2, slip, 3, 4. The words were quiet, but in the silence of the empty park, they felt loud enough to echo. When the battery finally warned him with its last red sliver, He moved faster, squeezing in one final lesson before the screen went black. He memorized the sequence, stored it in his muscles, and stood. In the faint glow of a distant street lamp, he threw the combination he had just studied. His fists cut through the night air with awkward urgency, his feet sliding to match the rhythm of men who had fought under brighter lights than he would ever see. The air offered no applause, no correction, just the resistance of emptiness. But he threw again, and again, until the movement belonged to him, not the screen. When the phone finally died, he tucked it back into his pocket. The screen smudged with fingerprints and the faint trace of blood from a cracked knuckle. Act! He didn't need it anymore. Not tonight. The images had already settled in him. His shoulders carried the rhythm, his lungs carried the cadence, and the silence of the park became his ring. Every lesson learned in fragments would be tested in shadow. Every shadow was another round. Hunger was the opponent that never left the ring. It followed him through mornings when he awoke with his stomach hollow, and through nights when the summer ops, when the sound of it growling kept him restless. The weight of it pressed down not in sudden blows, but in the slow erosion of strength, a constant reminder that food was never guaranteed. Sometimes breakfast was nothing more than a slice of bread gone, stale, torn into pieces, and swallowed dry. On better days, there might be rice with a thin broth, but more often the meals skipped themselves. Leaving him to train with little more than stubbornness keeping him upright, his body showed it in small ways. His hoodie hung looser than it should, the sleeves slipping further over his hands each month. His cheeks were narrow, his wrists thin enough that the cloth wraps he used for boxing overlapped too many times around them. Yet he moved with a drive that made the absence of weight look like an advantage. His fists struck fast, his steps darted quickly across the cracked ground. As if hunger had made him lighter, pulling flesh away but leaving determination untouched. The days stretched long with small jobs that filled just enough space to buy another day. He carried groceries for strangers, their bags biting into his fingers until his knuckles swelled. He swept sidewalks in front of shops where no one remembered his name once he left. Sometimes he washed car windows at stoplights, moving quickly. Before the traffic surged forward again, coins dropped into his pocket here and there, never enough to add up to more than a single meal, but he accepted each one with a nod and moved on. There was no room for pride when the belly reminded him every hour that pride had no calories. Between these jobs, he slipped back to the park, the cracked concrete waiting for him like a silent opponent. Hunger came with him, curling around his ribs, but he never used it as an excuse. If anything, it sharpened his resolve. When his legs trembled during footwork drills, he told himself it was fatigue from training, not weakness from emptiness. When his vision blurred after too many rounds of shadowboxing, he blinked until the world steadied again. He refused to admit to himself that he was starving, because to name it would make it real, and real things had the power to stop him. He learned to push his body in fragments. A few minutes of shadowboxing until his arms ached, then a pause to catch his breath and swallow the dryness in his throat. A quick sprint across the length of the park, his shoes slapping the ground, before slowing to walk and hide the fact that his chest burned. Each fragment was another round against hunger, another proof that even on an empty stomach, he could still move. Sometimes he would sit on the bench afterward, head bowed, hands resting limp on his knees. He looked not like a fighter, but like someone worn down by too many hours awake. Yet the moment his breath slowed, he would rise again, fists raised, as though the stillness itself was an admission he couldn't afford. Hunger wanted him still. Training kept him alive at night. He counted the coins from the day's jobs, laying them out in small piles on his mattress. He weighed the decision carefully each time, food or another replacement for his fraying hand wraps. More often than not, food won, but not always. There were nights he chose equipment, convincing himself that one more day hungry was worth the durability to keep punching tomorrow. Stomach protested, twisting in knots, but his mind leaned forward, toward the image of himself stronger, sharper, faster. The physical toll revealed itself in places no one else saw. His ribs pressed against his skin when he stretched. His knees ached when he squatted too low in his stance, the bones creaking with the absence of fuel to keep them steady. His lips cracked in the cold air, dry from dehydration. But none of it outweighed the need that burned behind his eyes, the thing he could not fully name. It was not simply a dream of being a fighter, it was the belief that his fists, raw and unpolished as they were, might someday punch through the cage his life had built around him. Hunger did not leave him, but he learned to carry it, to wear it like a second skin. When he trained, the emptiness in his stomach became part of the rhythm, a reminder that pain did not always come from punches, it came from living. And if he could live with this, if he could keep moving with nothing inside him, then maybe one day he could step into a ring filled not with silence and cracked pavement, but with lights, noise, and an opponent whose hunger could never match his own. The park was never meant to be a gym, but he treated it as if it were built for him alone. Every corner, every object, every piece of broken structure became a station in his routine. Where others saw a light post leaning slightly to one side, he saw a heavy bag. He would circle it with measured steps, fists raised, throwing combinations against the cold steel. His knuckles didn't strike it directly. He knew better than to break bones on iron, but his fists stopped just short, snapping at the air with the same intention as if a bag swung there. The clang of his shoes scraping against the pavement filled the silence, echoing like the faint rhythm of a bell starting a round. A cracked wooden bench served as his step platform. He pressed one foot down, then the other, rising and lowering in repetitions that left his legs shaking. The wood creaked under his weight, but it held. When the tremors in his thighs grew too sharp, he forced himself to keep climbing. Imagined. Each step was the ring apron, the act of lifting himself onto a stage that was not yet his, but would be someday. Sweat darkened the surface of the bench where his palms pressed for balance, a stain of effort that no one else noticed when they passed by. The gravel paths that cut across the grass became his sprint tracks. He marked distances in his mind, invisible lines drawn between trees and lampposts. He would explode forward in bursts, pushing his legs until stones scattered behind him. The sound of gravel shifting underfoot was sharp, each stride louder than the last. He measured his pace not by distance but by breath, running until his chest burned too fiercely to hold steady, then walking until he could trick himself into another round. At times he stumbled, his ankles catching in the uneven ground, but he always pushed on, refusing to let the park's broken terrain slow him. The swing set, abandoned by children who had long since grown up, turned into a tool for balance drills. He gripped the chains tightly, leaning back, feeling the muscles in his arms resist as his body tilted. He shifted his weight forward, then back again, forcing his core to hold him steady. The rusty chains rattled loudly, carrying their protest into the empty air. But he didn't let go until his arms could no longer keep him steady. Each creak of metal was another round completed, another reminder that even ruin had its use. Even the trees became partners in his training. He planted himself in front of their broad trunks, weaving left and right around them as if they were opponents pressing forward. He threw hooks that curved just shy of the bark, jabs that stopped an inch before splinters could bite into his knuckles. He pivoted around roots, forcing his footwork to remain quick and precise. The trees never moved, but he imagined them advancing, their shadows falling across him like challengers too large to ignore. He did push-ups in the dirt, his palms grinding into the ground until his skin collected grit. He counted slowly, his arms lowering until his chest nearly brushed the earth, then forcing himself upward again. The smell of soil filled his lungs, mixing with the salt of sweat dripping from his forehead. When his arms gave out, he let himself fall flat, then rolled onto his back, staring up at the dull sky until he could rise again. Even the earth beneath him became part of the lesson. Where others saw ruin, he saw possibility. The fence surrounding the park became his rope for resistance. Work. He grabbed hold of it, pulling his body backward, forcing his shoulders and arms to strain. The tension cut into his palms, but he didn't loosen his grip. Every surface offered resistance. Every obstacle became another tool to push him further. The park came alive with his imagination. The sound of fists cutting through air mixed with the clang of chains, the scrape of sneakers, the steady thump of his breath. To a stranger, it might have looked like nothing more than a boy moving awkwardly through broken structures, a game of pretending. but to him, it was real. Each station was part of a circuit, each drill a piece of a fight no one else could see. He trained in cycles, moving from lamppost to bench to gravel path, repeating the routine until the shapes blurred together. His shirt clung damp against his back, his arms hung heavy at his sides, yet his eyes carried a focus that kept him pressing forward. The park, abandoned and unremarkable to others, had become the space where his future might be written. No walls, no bags, no ring. Just a boy carving meaning into the world with fists, sweat, and imagination. The gym he couldn't enter, he built from the ground he already had. And though no bell rang to start or end his rounds, the silence itself became the referee, always waiting for him to decide when he had done enough. He never did. The boy was already deep into his routine when the figure first appeared. His fists snapped at the air, his shoes scraping across the cracked pavement with quick, uneven shuffles. Sweat darkened the collar of his hoodie, and his breath rose in visible clouds against the chill of late afternoon. He had no audience, no voice guiding him through combinations, only the rhythm of his body and the stubborn refusal to stop when fatigue demanded otherwise. He didn't notice the sound of footsteps entering the park, didn't glance at the man who slipped into the background like another shadow among the trees. The newcomer wore a hooded jacket pulled low, hands buried in his pockets, his stride unhurried. At first glance, he looked like any other passerby, another man taking a shortcut through the park, but his eyes were sharp beneath the hood, following the boy's every movement with the focus of someone who had spent a lifetime studying what fists could and could not do. He paused near the edge of the cracked basketball court, far enough to remain outside the boy's awareness, close enough to measure him with precision. The boy's punches were raw, his footwork sloppy in places, his guard too low after the third strike in every combination. Yet there was something in his rhythm that kept the man's eyes fixed. A natural cadence, an instinctive twist of the hips that sent power forward even without guidance. He wasn't fast enough yet, wasn't sharp enough, but there was hunger in every motion, a refusal to let weakness dictate the end of the round. That hunger was what kept the man still, watching. The boy shifted toward a lamppost, circling it as if it were a heavy bag, throwing hooks that curved into empty air. His fists stopped just short of the metal, each strike accompanied by a sharp exhale through clenched teeth. The man's gaze didn't waver. He noted the balance in the boy's stance, the way his back foot dragged slightly on the turn, the way his shoulders hunched when fatigue set in. He saw every flaw, but he also saw the thing beneath it, an uncoached determination that couldn't be taught. Only tested. Children shouted somewhere beyond the park, their laughter spilling faintly through the fence, but neither the boy nor the man turned toward it. The world outside seemed irrelevant to the exchange happening in silence. The boy trained, unaware that he had become the subject of scrutiny. The man observed, making no sound, offering no interruption, his stillness deliberate. Minutes passed, the boy moving through drills with no pause. His thin arms trembled when he threw his punches too wide, his breath hitching in short bursts. He pushed himself until the weight of his own exhaustion bent him forward. He bent his knees, steadied himself, and raised his fists again.
That single
Act the refusal to let his body collapse made. The man's lips press into the faintest suggestion of approval beneath the hood. The boy's shoes scraped against gravel as he sprinted the short stretch between lampposts, lungs heaving. When he slowed, dragging his feet back toward the bench to start step-ups, he finally lifted his head. For a brief moment, his eyes swept across the park, but they didn't linger where the man stood. He saw only emptiness, convinced he was still. Alone, the man kept his stance relaxed, his presence swallowed by the stillness around him. He didn't approach, didn't speak. He simply waited, measuring the boy the way a seasoned fighter measures an opponent in the opening seconds of a bout. Not rushing, not revealing, only cataloging what lay in front of him. The boy swung again, shadow boxing under the dull glow of the setting sun, and the man stayed rooted to the spot, as silent as the trees behind him. When the boy finally dropped onto the bench, chest rising and falling, fists limp at his sides, the man shifted slightly. He could have stepped forward then, offered a word, revealed himself. Instead, he turned away. His footsteps faded into the distance, steady and unhurried, leaving no clue he had ever been there. The boy wiped his forehead with the edge of his sleeve, staring at the ground as if searching for enough strength to begin another round. He had no idea that someone had just weighed him, noted his flaws, and recognized something beneath them. The park returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence. It held a trace of something unspoken, the kind of silence that lingers after being broken by a watchful presence. The boy remained unaware, but the man carried the image of him away, catalogued and stored. Waiting for another day, the voices never really left him. They lived in the back of his head, sharper some days than others, cutting into him with words that had been spoken years before, but never forgotten. Too small, too weak. He heard them first as a child, standing in schoolyards where bigger boys shoved past him and laughed when he tried to push back. Later it came from adults, voices heavy with the certainty of people who believed they were simply being realistic. You'll never last. You don't have the build. Boxing isn't for kids. Like you, the words sank into him deeper than any bruise. Each time his fists rose, those shadows rose with them. He would circle the lamppost, sweat dripping into his eyes, and in the rhythm of his punches, he could almost hear the echoes. When his arms slowed from fatigue, the voices reminded him that slowing meant failure. When his chest burned from lack of food and oxygen, the memory whispered that he had no future in this fight, that he should quit before he broke himself completely. Doubt was a chorus, and it sang loudest when he was weakest, but he never spoke back. His answers came in movement, not words. When the voices said his frame was too narrow, his shoulders too slight, he planted his feet and drove his fists into the empty air harder, faster, until his lungs screamed. When they said he lacked the strength, he forced himself to lift his thin body over and over on the rusty swing chains, pulling until his arms shook so violently he had to bite down on the inside of his cheek to keep from crying out. His silence was deliberate. Words never changed anyone's mind about him before. Only work might. Still, he couldn't stop himself from remembering. He remembered the coach who had watched him train once at a community center, looked at him for no more than 30 seconds, and told him to try another sport. He remembered neighbors who shook their heads when they saw him shadow boxing in the park, muttering that dreams like his were for people with money, with gyms, with someone to show them the way. He remembered his own relatives who had told him to stop wasting time, to get a real job, and stop pretending he could fight. He trained with those memories carved into him, each punch a rejection of what he had been told. There were nights he almost believed the voices. When his legs gave out after a sprint and he hit the ground, palms scraped raw against gravel, it felt like they had been right all along. When his stomach cramped so badly from hunger that he couldn't stand upright, he thought maybe this really was impossible. He would sit on the bench with his head hanging low, sweat cooling on his skin, telling himself he was done for the day. Sometimes his hands shook, not from exertion, but from the weight of despair pressing down. But after a few minutes, something always forced him back to his feet. His body, worn and frail as it was, could not bear the thought of letting the words be true. The shadows of doubt never disappeared, but they gave him something to fight against when no opponent stood across from him. Each one became a figure in front of him, faceless but solid. Too weak, he answered with a jab. Too small, he answered with a hook. You'll never make it, he answered with a flurry that left his lungs burning. The more they said, the harder he moved, until the echoes blurred into the sound of his own breath. Ragged and relentless. He didn't know if the silence of his fists would ever be enough to prove them wrong. He didn't know if there would come a day when anyone outside this park would see the hours he poured into movements that bruised his body without ever touching another person. But each night, as he dragged himself home with his hoodie soaked and his shoes filled with grit, he carried a small truth with him. The voices had spoken, and he had not obeyed. His fists had kept swinging, and as long as he could keep answering that way, the doubt could not fully win. The boy was midway through a round that had already stretched too long. His arms were heavy, his shoulders burning with each punch he forced into the air. Sweat rolled down his temples, stinging his eyes, but he refused to lower his fists. The pavement beneath him was slick with the dust he'd kicked up, his shoes dragging clumsily as he tried to mimic the tight pivots he'd studied the night before on his cracked phone. His chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, and still he pressed forward, throwing punches at an opponent who wasn't there. The world around him was a blur of ordinary sounds, traffic humming faintly in the distance, leaves shifting in the breeze, the soft creak of the swings in the wind. None of it mattered. He was locked inside his rhythm, the metronome of his breath marking each strike. That was when the voice cut through, low and simple, just 3 words. "Keep your hands up." He froze. The words landed sharper than any punch, slicing through the bubble of his solitude. His fists stopped midair, held awkwardly at chest level, his lungs still pumping as though he hadn't been told to stop. He turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the edge of the park. At first he saw nothing but the long stretch of fence and the empty bench at the far end. Then he caught sight of a man in a hooded jacket walking past, hands in his pockets, his stride unhurried. The boy couldn't tell if the words had come from him. The tone had been calm, almost careless, like someone tossing advice, without caring whether it landed. For a moment he thought he might have imagined it, that the sound had been pulled from his own memory, the echo of a coach he'd once overheard correcting someone else. But the man's head tilted ever so slightly as he passed. As though acknowledging what he'd seen, the boy stood rooted, his fists slackening at his sides. He wanted to call out, to ask if the words were meant for him, but his throat clenched. Shut, he had grown used to silence. Silence was safer than risking mockery. The man kept walking, the hood shading his face, his steps carrying him toward the exit of the park. No pause, no second glance, just a passing presence that left behind a ripple in the boy's world. He raised his fists again, awkwardly pulling them higher now, closer to his chin. The command, if it had been a command decode in his head. Keep your hands up. He tried to hold them steady, to let the words shape his stance. His shoulders ached more quickly, his arms quivering under the effort, yet he did not lower them. He threw another jab, then a cross, each one tighter, sharper, as though the unseen watcher might still be there. Judging whether he had listened, when the round ended, he dropped onto the bench, his body collapsing forward. He searched the park again, scanning every corner for the hooded figure. The man was gone. The silence had returned, heavy and complete, broken only by the ragged sound of his breathing. For a moment the boy wondered if it had truly happened. People did not stop for him, did not notice him enough to offer corrections. Why would a stranger care if his hands stayed up or not? But the words clung to him like sweat. He replayed them again and again, testing the sound in his head, trying to decide whether they had been real. Lifted his fists once more, holding them high until his arms trembled, until his shoulders screamed. The pain felt different now, less like exhaustion, more like a demand he couldn't ignore. Keep your hands up. Long after the man had disappeared, long after the sun began to sink and the shadows stretched across the cracked pavement, the boy was still there, fists raised, uncertain if he had been corrected by a stranger or haunted by a voice that belonged only to him. The moment was gone, brief as a jab, but it left a mark that lingered. It's a kind that shapes how a fighter moves long after the round has ended. He had found them in a trash bin, behind a gym he had never been allowed to enter. They weren't even a pair at first, just one glove with the padding nearly flat, and another discovered weeks later. The leather so cracked, it looked like dried riverbeds splitting across the surface. The stitching frayed in jagged lines, and the Velcro barely clung to itself, leaving the straps loose around his wrists no matter how tightly he pulled. Still, they were gloves, and for him that meant more than their condition. He carried them home in his backpack as if they were treasures, and when he slid his hands inside for the first time, he felt, however briefly, like he belonged to something bigger than himself. They didn't fit. His fingers pressed awkwardly against the seams, his thumbs jammed in stiff positions that made them ache. The inner lining had worn thin, leaving the rough underside of the leather to rub against his skin. Within minutes, his knuckles burned, scraped raw where the padding had given up years ago. Yet he clenched his fists tighter, lifting them to his chin as though the gloves were armor. To anyone else, they were trash. To him, they were proof that he had stepped closer to being what he imagined. Each punch told the truth of their age. When he struck the trunk of a tree, the impact shuddered through his hands, bone rattling against bark. The padding offered almost no protection, and the shock left his knuckles stinging long after he pulled back. He shook his hands out, flexed his fingers until the pain dulled, then struck again. The leather split further at the seams with each session, small tears widening until his skin pressed through, bare and unguarded. It didn't matter. He had learned to live with the sting, even to welcome it. As if pain were a tax required to prove his seriousness, sometimes the gloves slipped. Mid-round, twisting on his hands so his punches landed crooked, he would stop only long enough to wrench the straps tighter, teeth gritted, before resuming. His hands emerged from training marked in red, the skin raw and sometimes bleeding. But he wrapped them with scraps of cloth to hide the damage. He could not afford to stop. He had no second pair, no replacements waiting. These would have to last as long as his will could make them. At night, when he laid them beside his bed, he studied every tear and fray. His fingertips traced the broken stitches like a map, following the lines of failure with quiet fascination. He thought of the hands that had worn them before, hands that had been allowed inside the gym he could only circle from outside. Those hands had grown too strong for these gloves, cast them aside without thought. Now they were his, and though they hurt him, they were the only link he had to a world where gloves were meant to protect, not punish. The smell of old leather clung to him during training, mixed with sweat and the faint iron temps of blood. It became part of the atmosphere, as familiar as the cracks in the pavement and the hiss of his breath. He punched until his arms gave out, then pulled the gloves off slowly, peeling them from swollen fingers. His skin beneath was red knuckles, scabbed and reopening with every session, but he studied them with a strange pride. Each mark was proof that the gloves still had work left in them. The pain grew sharper as the weeks passed, the gloves offering less protection with each tear. But he refused to let that stop him. He adjusted his strikes, taught himself to punch cleaner, not to waste motion, not to land awkwardly where the lack of padding would split him open. In their brokenness, the gloves had forced him to refine himself. One evening, as the light fell, across the park and shadows stretched long across the cracked ground, he sat on the bench lacing them back up. The Velcro hung loose, the straps curling like dead leaves, but he tightened them anyway. His fists looked pitiful, wrapped in what others would see as junk, but when he stood and threw his first punch, the sound of leather cutting air carried with it the echo of something larger. He was no longer a boy swinging bare hands at shadows. He was a fighter with gloves, however broken, and he would keep punching until they dissolved entirely. If they tore apart on his fists, then his fists would carry on alone. The pain was only detail. What mattered was that he never stopped. The boy had grown accustomed to training alone. So much so that the rhythm of his fists and feet had become a kind of shield against the world. Every day he slipped into the same rituals, the cracked gloves pulled tight, the deep breath before the first punch, the stubborn refusal to quit even when his body begged for rest. The park was empty more often than not, just the occasional jogger or dog walker passing through without more than a curious glance. He liked it that way. Solitude meant no one could see his mistakes. No one could laugh at the crooked angles of his punches or the way his footwork stumbled across the gravel. But lately, he had started to feel something different. A weight that wasn't the ache in his shoulders or the heaviness of hunger. A weight that pressed from somewhere outside himself. He felt it first in the stillness. The sound of his punches echoed slightly too long, as if someone was listening for them, measuring their rhythm. He glanced around between combinations, quick flicks of his eyes toward the benches, the fence, the tree line. Nothing ever moved, yet the sense remained, steady and unshakable. He tried to ignore it, to let his fists drown it out. But each swing only sharpened the awareness. On one particular evening, the light fading gold over the cracked pavement, he knew he wasn't imagining it. His fists rose to guard, his breath steady as he drilled jabs in repetition, and out of the corner of his eye, a figure leaned against the far railing. Hood pulled low, hands sunk into his jacket pockets. The man barely moved. He could have been just another passerby resting his legs, but there was no casualness in his stillness. His head tilted ever so slightly with each punch. Like a metronome tracking the boy's form, the boy's punches faltered, his arms stiffening as the pressure of unseen judgment fell over him. He lowered his fists halfway, then snapped them back. Up, unsure whether to continue. The man didn't speak, he only lingered, his posture neither inviting nor dismissive, as if silence itself were the correction. The boy swallowed hard and resumed, jabbing faster now, desperate to prove something, though he didn't know what. His footwork stumbled over the uneven ground, and in that instant the man's head shook once. Almost imperceptibly, it was enough. The boy felt heat rush to his face. He reset, forced his feet under him, tried again. This time he kept his steps tighter, lighter, the way he'd seen in the grainy videos on his phone. He sensed approval in the lack of movement, in the steady gaze that offered no further shake of disapproval. He worked through the round with a tension in his chest unlike anything he'd felt before. It wasn't the solitude of fighting shadows, nor the indifference of the world passing by. It was present, silent, measuring, impossible to ignore. His body ached to collapse, but he pushed harder, afraid that if he stopped, the figure might vanish and take with him the strange gravity of his watchfulness. When at last he dropped onto the bench. Gasping, he dared to glance fully across the park. The man was still there, hands still tucked in his pockets, shoulders broad under the fabric of the jacket. He had not moved once. For a moment their eyes almost met, though the hood shadowed the man's face too well to be sure. Then, just as quietly as he had appeared, the figure straightened and walked away, his steps deliberate, unhurried, leaving the boy alone again. The silence afterward was crushing. The boy stared at the space where the man had stood, his chest heaving, his gloves hanging limp at his sides. He didn't know why the presence mattered so much, only that it had. The corrections had been wordless, carried in the shift of a head, the smallest tilt of a body, yet they had landed heavier than any voice, heavier even than the voices of doubt that usually haunted him. For the rest of the night, as he replayed the session in his head, he imagined that gaze still on him. It forced him to stand straighter, to keep his fists up even in exhaustion, to step with more care over the broken pavement. He didn't know who the man was, or why he bothered to linger, but he knew this. Training alone no longer felt the same. The weight of another's eyes had changed something in him. Even when the park was empty, he felt them there, a silent judge watching every punch. The mornings came the same as they always had. Cracked pavement under his feet, gloves too loose around his wrists, the sting of cold air filling his lungs before the first punch landed. Yet something was different now. The da the boy carried with him. The ghost of that lingering gaze, the quiet corrections etched into his movements. Each time he threw a jab, he imagined it being measured by unseen eyes. Each time he slipped a punch at the air, he felt the same invisible presence tilting its head, judging the angle of his body. It was during one of those evenings, the park, still damp from an afternoon rain, that a clue appeared. The boy was stretching his arms near the chain-link fence when he noticed a flyer plastered on the metal. The paper had been there for some time, its edges curling, ink running where water had bled into it. But the image remained sharp enough to recognize a towering figure. Arms raised in triumph under glaring lights, a championship belt strapped across his waist. The headline, though smudged, carried a name he'd heard whispered in gyms and shouted from televisions and houses he'd only ever glimpsed through windows. It was a name carved into the fabric of the sport itself, a name spoken with both reverence and fear. He froze, staring at the poster until his eyes blurred. The resemblance was undeniable. The broad frame, the shoulders like iron gates, the same. Calm tilt of the head. The man who had watched him wasn't just anyone. He was someone whose face appeared on walls and billboards, someone the world celebrated as a champion. The boy looked around instinctively, as if expecting to catch the figure materializing from the shadows again. But the park was empty except for a woman walking her dog on the far path. Still, he couldn't shake the way the air seemed thicker, as though the champion's presence lingered even in absence. He turned back to the flyer, tracing the name. With his eyes, It wasn't just recognition, it was suspicion, fragile and unbelievable. Why would a man like that wander through a forgotten park watching a boy beat his fists against tree trunks in the air? The whispers came next. A pair of teenagers passing by noticed the gloves dangling from his hands and stopped long enough to smirk. One of them nudged the other, gesturing toward the far bench, where the hooded figure had stood nights before. "That's where he was," one said, lowering his voice as though invoking something sacred. "Swear to God, I saw him. That's him, the champ." His friend shook his head, laughed nervously, but their voices carried just enough to lodge. In the boy's mind, he turned toward the bench, the weight of their words settling heavy in his chest. Could it really be true? Could the champion this name plastered across posters, written into headlines, whispered about in the park, have chosen to stand silently in the same space where he struggled to make sense of his own fists? That night, lying awake on the thin mattress in his room, he replayed every detail. The way the man's shoulders filled his jacket, the controlled stillness in how he stood, the subtle shake of his head when the boy's footwork faltered. It all matched what little he remembered from the cracked phone screen where he'd studied highlight reels. The champion had the same patience inside the ring, the same ability to say everything without words. Doubt clawed at him. Maybe he wanted it too badly wanted to believe that greatness had brushed against his small, hidden world. Maybe he was building illusions out of shadows and silence. But every time he closed his eyes, the image of the poster bled into the memory of the hooded man at the fence, and the two refused to separate. The next day, when he returned to the park, the flyer still clung to the fence. He ran his fingers over the damp paper, feeling the grooves of the ink as though it could confirm what his mind already knew. He whispered the name under his breath, tasting the weight of it, as if saying it aloud might summon the figure again. It wasn't a name like his own, one that slipped easily into forgetfulness. This was a name carved in sweat and history, a name that people wore on shirts, chanted in arenas, and passed down in stories about unforgettable fights. The boy tightened. His gloves, their fraying straps scratching against his wrists, and stepped back onto the cracked pavement. His fists rose, heavier now, as though the name itself had been strapped to them. If the champion had truly seen him, truly chosen to stand there, in silence, then every punch he threw was no longer only for himself. It was for that gaze, for that name, for the possibility that someone who had carved themselves into the sport had found reason to pause at the sight of a boy training. Alone in a forgotten park, the boy was deep into his routine, body bent with fatigue but refusing to stop. His fists struck the air in broken rhythms, sometimes sharp, sometimes dragging, as if the weight of hunger clung to them. Shoes scraped the pavement, their soles frayed to the edge of tearing, and the sound echoed faintly against the stillness of the park. He had learned not to expect an audience. His world was small and closed, built of repetition and silence. But lately, the silence felt inhabited, carrying the strange pressure of being watched. That evening, the hooded figure returned. The man stood by the same fence as before, arms crossed, his presence so steady it almost blended into the scenery. The boy caught sight of him only when he turned out of a combination, a jab cross hook that sent his body spinning halfway around. His breath caught, and for a split second he faltered, but he forced himself back into the rhythm, pretending he hadn't noticed. Yet every punch he threw from then on felt heavier, as though he had to prove something to those unseen eyes. The champion didn't move for a long while. He leaned against the fence post, shoulders relaxed, watching each misstep, each raw attempt at precision. When the boy's punches began to sag, and his guard slipped lower, the man finally shifted. His footsteps sounded soft against the gravel path as he came closer, his face still obscured by the hood's shadow. The boy froze mid-combination, his chest heaving, fists trembling in the air. He expected nothing, maybe a smirk, maybe the same silence that always lingered between them. Instead, the man's voice came low and steady, so calm it almost startled him more than a shout would have. "Meet me here tomorrow," he said. His tone carried no urgency, no emotion, just the weight of a statement that seemed to leave no room for refusal. Then he added, after a pause, "Bring nothing but yourself." The words hung there in the air, too simple to make sense, too sharp to ignore. The boy blinked, his mouth opening to speak, but nothing came. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to ask what for. But his throat tightened, and the questions shrank back inside him. By the time he could breathe again, the man was already turning. Away his steps, unhurried, his hands sliding back into the pockets of his jacket. The boy stood alone, fists slack at his sides. The echo of those words repeated itself until it almost felt like a command. Meet me here tomorrow. Bring nothing but yourself. They sounded strange, too deliberate, to be casual, too thin, to be comforting. There had been no reassurance, no hint of explanation. It's just a direction, spoken by someone who seemed to expect to be obeyed. He sat down on the bench, his gloves dangling from his wrists. The frayed seam scratching his skin. His mind raced, trying to find meaning in what had just happened. Why would a man like that, if he truly was who the boy suspected, take interest in someone like him? And what could tomorrow bring, except disappointment or danger? The park was quiet again, the man's presence reduced to a memory. The boy rubbed his knuckles, feeling the sting where the cracked gloves failed to shield them, and tried to picture what tomorrow might look like. Would he come back with mitts, with gear, with the promise of training? Or would it be nothing, just another test of whether the boy would show up at all? That night, lying on his thin mattress in the dim room, he couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, hearing the words replay in his mind, their sharpness cutting into him over and over. Imagine walking into the park and finding no one. There, imagine standing alone with his fists raised while the silence mocked him. And yet beneath the fear, there was something else, an ember of hope so small he hardly dared to name it. By morning, his body still ached, his stomach growled with its usual emptiness, but his mind was fixed on the only task that mattered: to be there, to stand where he was told, to bring nothing but himself. For the first time, it felt like perhaps that might be enough. The boy arrived before the sun had fully risen, the air still damp with night's retreat. His hands were bare, his cracked gloves left behind as instructed. He stood by the bench where he had spent so many hours alone, shifting his weight nervously, wondering if he had imagined everything. Then, without ceremony, the man appeared. No grand entrance, no entourage, just a hood pulled low, steps quiet against the gravel, as if he had been there all along, watching. The boy straightened instinctively, shoulders tense. He expected words, an explanation, maybe even equipment. Instead, the man's gaze settled on him with calm finality. And then he motioned with a small tilt of his chin, directing the boy to an open patch of pavement. There was no ring, no ropes, no audience, only the rough ground and the stillness of early morning. The boy obeyed without a sound. Feet, the man said, his voice level, quiet enough that the boy had to lean into it. Show me where you stand. Awkwardly, the boy spread his feet as he always had, one slightly in front of the other, fists raised high near his face. He had copied the stance from videos, half guessing at the details. The man studied it for a long moment, then stepped closer. With a single hand, he nudged the boy's back foot an inch to the side, pressed his shoulder down until it loosened, then tapped his elbow inward. It was the first time anyone had ever touched his posture, the first time his form had been corrected not by a screen, but by a living presence. Again, the man said. The boy reset himself, fumbling, trying to remember the adjustments. Muscles fought against the change, craving the familiar, but the man stopped him again with a shake of the head. Balance. You're standing like you want to run. You fight from here. He pressed lightly against the boy's chest. The boy nearly toppled backward, and you'll fall before a punch even lands. Embarrassment flushed through the boy, but he bit down on it. He tightened his stance, shifted weight lower until his feet pressed more evenly against the ground. The man gave a small nod, not praise exactly, but acknowledgement. Good, he murmured. Now breathe. The boy frowned, confused. He had come expecting combinations, punches, drills that would burn through his muscles. Instead, the man stood in front of him, demonstrating a slow inhale, chest expanding, shoulders steady. You breathe wrong, too high. All up here. He tapped his own collarbone. You'll tire out before the fight even begins. Breathe from here. He touched his stomach. Deep, controlled, always. The boy tried, awkward at first, sucking in air until his chest heaved. The man shook his head again. Too much. Smooth. He demonstrated the rhythm of breath, steady, unbroken, as if even the act of inhaling carried discipline. Minutes passed, then more. The lesson repeating: stance, balance, breath. No punches thrown, no gloves required.
Ow.
The boy's frustration simmered quietly. He wanted action, movement, the satisfaction of fists cutting air. But the man's silence and precision forced him into patience. Each correction chipped away at habits he hadn't known were wrong. At one point, the man stepped back, letting the boy stand alone in the stillness, body aligned, breathing steady. "Feel it," he said at last. "Before you learn to fight, you learn not to fall. Before you throw, you learn to breathe." The boy closed his eyes, unsure why the words struck so deeply. I had always thought fighting was about force, about how hard and fast he could strike. But here in the middle of a cracked park with number ring, no gloves, no equipment, he felt something different take root. He felt the foundation he had never been given. By the time the sun cleared the rooftops, his legs burned from holding the stance. His stomach tightened from drawing air properly, and sweat dripped down his back, though he hadn't thrown a single punch. The man finally stepped away, his face still unreadable beneath the hood. "Tomorrow," he said simply. Then he walked off, leaving the boy planted in the same patch of pavement. Trembling, but steady, a different kind of tired spreading through him. For the first time, the boy understood what it meant to be trained, not by videos, not by guesswork, but by the hand of someone who knew. It wasn't glory, not yet. It was foundation. It was the beginning. The boy woke the next morning sore in places he didn't know could ache. His legs felt heavy, as if weights were strapped to his ankles, and his stomach tightened with every breath. Still, he returned to the park. The man was already there, waiting in the same silence as before, who'd drawn over his brow, arms crossed. No greeting came, only emotion, a sharp tilt of the head that sent the boy into position. The first drill seemed simple. Hold the stance. Pivot, shift weight forward and back, again and again. At first the boy thought it would be manageable, but within minutes his thighs screamed and his calves tightened. He wanted to stand up straight to shake it off, but the man's gaze pinned him in place. Sweat rolled down his face and into his eyes, burning. Still, the order remained unspoken. "Keep going." When the boy stumbled, the man's voice finally cut the air. "You think the body gives up first? It doesn't. The mind quits before the body does. You train the mind, the body follows." The boy tried to nod, but his chest heaved too violently. His breath rasped, shallow and uneven. He remembered yesterday's lesson and forced himself to draw air lower, into the stomach, even as cramps threatened to double him over. His fists trembled, his feet dragged, but he stayed in the drill, clinging to the thought that if he stopped, the man would turn and walk away forever. The drills changed without warning. Now he was told to shadow box in tight circles around the bench, punches thrown with precision while feet kept moving. He tried to replicate what he had seen on the cracked phone screen, but under fatigue the movements lost sharpness. His punches fell sloppy, his footwork lagged. "Discipline," the man said, stepping close, his tone calm but cutting. "Anyone can throw when they feel strong. Few can throw when they feel broken. That's the difference." The boy wanted to argue that he was tired, that he hadn't eaten since morning, that his gloves had torn and his knuckles stung from scraping against rough air, but he didn't speak. He swung again, sharper this time, ignoring the fire in his arms. His shoulders burned, as if hot metal pressed against them. His ribs cramped when he twisted. Every motion hurt. By midday his shirt clung to his body, soaked. Through, dirt streaked across his face from where he had collapsed against the ground. The man never shouted, never raised his voice. He only commanded with silence and the occasional word, reminders that cut deeper than any scream. "Again, hold it. Don't fall into yourself." The boy's body begged for rest, but each time he slowed, the man's shadow loomed, and he forced himself back into pace. He began to realize the pain was not a punishment. It was a tool, a teacher with a language of its own. Every ache told him where he was weak. Every cramp revealed where discipline was missing. As the hours dragged on, his mind drifted toward quitting. The voices from before returned to small, too weak, not enough. They grew louder with each stumble. But as he looked up, the man stood unmoving, watching him endure. There was no pity in his eyes, but no mockery either. It's only expectation, as if he knew the boy could keep going even when the boy himself didn't believe it. The final drill came with fading light. Push-ups until his arms collapsed, then hold the plank when his chest could no longer lift. His whole body shook violently, face pressed against gravel, but he refused to let go. He thought of all the nights he had trained alone, of the hunger he had hidden, of the fights he had never been given. He thought of the one chance standing here in silence, and it forced him to cling to the ground with shaking fists. When the man finally called it, there were no words of approval, no comfort. He only said, "Discipline will keep you standing when talent runs out." Then he turned, leaving the boy sprawled across the pavement, muscles twitching, lungs burning. The boy lay there long after, staring up at the dimming sky, body trembling but unbroken. He understood now that pain was not the enemy. It was the measure. It was the proof that he had not stopped. As long as he could endure it, he had something no one could take from him. The boy arrived the next day with the same stiffness, clinging to his body. But the sting of yesterday's drills had dulled into a strange kind of pride. He had not broken, not fully, and that knowledge carried him forward. The man was waiting, as always, silent against the backdrop of the park. The hood was pulled low over his eyes, but in the way he stood, in the stillness of his frame. There was a story the boy could feel without hearing it told. They began without words. Footwork first, tight pivots on the cracked pavement, then jabs, snapped into the air with sharper precision than before. The boy focused on the rhythm, learning to make his breath the anchor of each strike. But between motions, he stole glances at the man. There was something about the way he watched, not just with the cold judgment of a teacher, but with the weight of someone who had walked this path himself. At one point, the drills paused. The man lifted his hands, shadowboxing slowly, almost absently, as if replaying some memory. His fists moved with the kind of ease that comes only after years of repetition. But there was no performance in it, no need to impress. It looked like remembrance, like he was revisiting the echoes of fights that had shaped him. His knuckles were scarred, his wrists thickened from decades of strain. When he shifted his stance, the boy caught a glimpse of his shoes worn down, patched at the sides, not the polished gear one might expect of a man who had seen the lights of televised arenas. The boy wanted to ask, but he held back. He knew enough now to understand that words were rarely offered. Still, something slipped through. As the man paused, eyes narrowing as if caught in another place, he muttered under his breath, "Basement gyms. No ring, just tape on the floor. Fought 3 boys in one night for $20? It wasn't said to be remembered. It was said because memory had surfaced and demanded air." The boy froze, hearing pieces of a past that mirrored his own hunger. He knew the kind of gyms described, though he had never stepped into one. He'd only heard about them sweat-soaked basements with mold creeping down the walls, where old trainers kept count with cigarette smoke curling above their heads. Fights that weren't recorded, weren't sanctioned, but left marks on both skin and spirit. The man had lived through it, had carried himself out of it. That knowledge hung in the silence between them. Training resumed, but now the boy moved differently. He saw in the champion's presence the path from broken courts and cracked gloves to arenas where names were chanted. Not because the man told him so, but because every scar, every weary line in his face carried proof. During sprints along the gravel, the man kept pace beside him, not with the vigor of youth, but with steady strides, as if reminding him that endurance mattered more than speed. When the boy faltered, when his legs begged him to stop, the man said only, "I was told I was nothing to." No elaboration followed, no description of who had spoken those words, or when. Yet the boy felt the truth of it. He'd heard those same dismissals himself, and now he knew they had once been hurled at the man standing before him, the man whose image he had seen on posters. As evening fell, the park emptied of the usual passersby. The boy stayed on the bench, dripping sweat, chest still heaving. The man leaned against the lamppost, arms folded, gaze distant. For a moment, the hood slipped back, and the boy saw his face clearly under the fading light.
Oh.
The features were familiar, traced from magazine covers, but up close they bore none of the gloss. There was wear, fatigue, a quiet history, written in lines that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with survival. The boy realized then that he didn't need the champion's full story, told in speeches or detailed confessions. The silence was enough. The very act of him standing here, day after day, without turning away, spoke louder than any tale of glory. It told the boy that persistence could carve a path out of places that tried to bury you, that even fists once dismissed as too weak could become weapons that commanded the world's attention. The training ended with no farewell. The man simply stepped away, fading back into the night as he always did. But the boy remained rooted, his chest tight, not with exhaustion but with a new kind of clarity. The silence the champion carried was not emptiness, it was a weight, a reminder of how far one could travel if they refused to yield. The boy tucked that lesson deep within himself, a flame lit not by words but by presence alone. The morning came with a coolness in the air. It's a kind that carried a faint promise of rain. The boy arrived earlier than usual, his hands wrapped in strips of cloth that were fraying badly, but still served their purpose. His muscles were sore, his ribs tender from the relentless drills, but his spirit clung tightly to the rhythm of showing up. The man was already there, as though he had been, waiting all night, leaning against the post with his hood drawn low. He didn't move until the boy dropped his bag, and stepped forward with the unhurried certainty of someone who had done this countless times before. Today was different. There was no instruction to throw jabs, no demand for footwork. Instead, the man raised his hands and gestured for the boy to do the same. His movements were deliberate, slow, making clear that this was not a fight, but a lesson. The boy obeyed, planting his feet wide, lifting his guard high, shoulders tight with anticipation. He expected to be told to punch again, but instead, a hand flicked forward, tapping against his glove with a snap that startled him. To open, the man muttered, and tapped again, slipping his knuckles neatly through the boy's guard. The boy reset, raising his arms higher, tucking his chin as best he could. But the champion's fists kept finding gaps, brushing against his temple, pressing against his chest, tapping the ribs with unnerving precision. None of the touches carried force, but each one landed with meaning, exposing the truth he had overlooked. An offense was worthless without the ability to endure and defend. At first, frustration gnawed at him. He wanted to throw punches, to show he had strength. But every time he twitched forward, the man's hands darted quicker, smothering his attempts. Not yet. The man's voice was firm, cutting off any thought of retaliation. Learn to stand, learn to last. Minutes turned into an hour, the boy's arms trembling under the weight of holding his guard high. Sweat ran down his forearms, soaking the strips of cloth. His shoulders burned, and each time he dropped his hands even slightly. A sharp tap from the man's glove reminded him of his mistake. The rhythm became punishing. Lift, block, absorb, reset. His body screamed to let go, to rest, but the man's expression remained impassive, demanding endurance without a single word of sympathy. As the boy's legs quivered, the man began to circle, pressing forward with light jabs, slipping hooks around the edges of his guard. He never struck hard, but he closed space, leaned in, crowded him until the boy felt caged. The lesson was clear. Panic opened holes, calm sealed them. Each time the boy exhaled too sharply, each time his balance shifted backward, the man's fists slipped through. But when he steadied his breathing, when he stood rooted, the taps grew fewer, the rhythm steadier. The boy began to understand. Defense was not just a shield. It was the ground on which everything else was built. Without it, every punch he threw was an invitation for punishment. He thought back to the nights watching old fights on his cracked phone, the replays of champions, slipping blows with a grace that seemed effortless. He'd admired their knockouts, their brutal finishes. But now he realized their victories were born in the unseen discipline of guard, of patience, of control under fire. By the time the man lowered his hands, the boy's arms were shaking uncontrollably. His breath ragged, his back drenched in sweat. He wanted to collapse, but instead, he kept standing, hands still faintly raised, unwilling to show weakness. The man gave the faintest nod, an acknowledgement not of success, but of effort. That alone felt heavier than any praise he had ever been given. The lesson ended as abruptly as it began. No explanation followed, no story about great fights or the importance of defense. The boy simply watched as the man stepped back, pulled the hood tighter, and began to walk away. But in his body, in the ache of his shoulders, in the sting of his forearms, the boy carried the truth. Power meant nothing if it couldn't survive the storm. Pressing back against it, he dropped onto the bench once the man disappeared from sight. His arms limp at his sides, his fists raw inside the torn wraps. The park was quiet again, the stillness broken only by the sound of his heaving breaths. Yet within him there was a new rhythm, a steady drumbeat of resolve. He would hold his ground no matter how heavy the weight of the world pressed. He would learn to endure before he learned to strike. That night, lying in his narrow bed with hunger twisting his stomach, he replayed the day's lesson in silence. His body hurt, but the pain no longer felt like punishment. It felt like the shape of something being built, piece by piece, foundation first. And for the first time, he began to imagine not just how hard he could hit, but how much he could withstand. The gravel crunched under their feet as the morning light spread thinly across the park. The boy already knew today would be different. The moment the man raised his chin and tightened his gloves, there was no slow introduction, no demonstration to watch from a distance. Instead, the man beckoned him forward and brought his fists up. The boy hesitated, then obeyed, raising his guard. For the first time, it wasn't just correction or pressure, it was sparring. The first jab came quick, sharper than anything the boy had faced before. It snapped his head back, grazing the bridge of his nose, and he stumbled 2 steps before he'd even thought of responding. He shook it off, adjusted his feet, and tried to jab back. The man slipped it easily, countering with a hook that thudded against his ribs, not full force, but enough to remind him that this was real. The boy's lungs strained, swung too wide, missed, and felt another punch find his cheek. The sting lit his skin, and the taste of iron filled his mouth. The rhythm was punishing. Every mistake was paid for in pain. The man was not cruel, but he was mercilessly accurate. Each gap in the boy's stance, each lapse in focus, each drop of his guard was answered by a glove against his body. The gravel beneath them shifted under hurried steps, and dust clung to the boy's sweat-slick skin. His arms grew heavy, his breath shallow, and still the punches kept coming, measured and precise. Then it happened. A right hand slipped through cleanly, splitting the skin just above his brow. The warmth of blood trickled down the side of his face, blurring his vision, mixing with the sweat that dripped from his temple. His chest heaved, panic rising with the metallic taste in his mouth. For a fleeting moment, everything inside him screamed to stop, to throw down his hands and walk away. He was too small, too hungry, too weak, exactly what they had always told him. But the man didn't stop. He didn't soften. He pressed forward with the same steady rhythm, his eyes watching closely. The boy realized then that mercy wasn't coming. If he was going to finish, it would be his decision, not the man's. Something clenched inside him. He gritted his teeth, wiped the blood with the back of his hand, and lifted his guard again. The spar continued. He absorbed punches, stumbled, swayed, but stayed upright. He threw his own jabs when he could, even if they missed or fell short. Every small motion became a battle, standing his ground, keeping his fists raised, refusing to crumble under the weight of exhaustion and pain. His body was screaming for release, but his mind latched onto a single thought: he would not quit here. Not in front of the man. Not when he had already bled for this. By the time the man stepped back and lowered His gloves, the boy was swaying on his feet, chest heaving as though he had run miles. His lip was split, his cheek swollen, and the cut above his eye was still leaking, leaving streaks down his face. He waited for words, praise, instruction, anything, but none came. The man only nodded once, the faintest gesture, before turning away. The boy stood there trembling, unable to tell whether that nod meant disappointment or approval. That night, as he sat on the edge of his bed with a rag pressed against his eye, the pain felt heavier than usual. His knuckles ached, his ribs throbbed, and his face stung each time the cloth touched the wound. Doubt crept in, whispering that maybe this wasn't worth it. That maybe all he would ever be was a boy bleeding on a forgotten patch of gravel. He lay down restless, listening to the creaks of the old apartment walls. The hunger in his stomach louder than sleep. When dawn broke, he almost didn't rise. His body begged for rest, his legs refused to move, yet something in him stirred. The thought of the man waiting, expecting him, pulled him out of bed. He wrapped his cut with tape, pulled on his frayed shoes, and walked back to the park. The man was there who'd drawn, standing as if he had never left. He looked at the boy's bruised face, at the swollen lip, at the clumsy bandage across his brow. His expression didn't change, but he didn't tell him to go home either. Instead, he simply raised his chin toward the clearing, the silent command to begin again. The boy obeyed, settling into his stance, arms trembling but still lifted. And for the first time he thought he saw something in the man's eyes. Not softness, but recognition. The kind that didn't need words. The kind that said returning was worth more than winning. The boy had bled and he had come back. That was enough for now. The air in the park was cool that morning, kind of chill that clung to the skin even after the body warmed. The boy laced his shoes tighter than usual, ignoring the soreness in his ribs from the last spar. His cut above the eye had scabbed over, the tape holding just enough to keep it closed. Every bruise was still there, each step reminding him of the punishment he had taken, but his feet carried him forward regardless. He had not forgotten the man's nod, faint though it was. It lingered like a promise he could not name. The champion stood waiting in the clearing, who'd pulled over his head, arms folded, said nothing, as always. His silence had become its own kind of language, and the boy had started to understand it. A raised chin meant it was time to begin. A narrowed eye meant a correction. A faint nod, rare and fleeting, meant he had done something right. Today, the man's expression was unreadable, his stance steady. His body carved by years of fights the boy had only seen on his cracked phone. They began with footwork drills. The boy's shoes scraped against the gravel, his steps uneven at first, then steadier as he focused on balance. The man moved around him, circling, forcing him to pivot and adjust, his own feet light despite his size. Then came the jab, sharp, repetitive, the rhythm of fists cutting through the air. The boy's arms burned quickly, but he pressed on, shoulders tightening, lungs pulling in the cold air like it was fire. The sparring started without words. The man lifted his gloves, slow and deliberate, and the boy mirrored him. Guard raised, though his arms still trembled from fatigue. The first exchange was all defense. The man's punches came measured, never reckless, testing the boy's guard. Some slipped through, landing against his ribs and cheeks, reminders of mistakes still uncorrected. The boy tried to answer back, but each swing was met with a slip, a block, or a counter that left him chasing shadows. Minutes passed, sweat dripping into the boy's eyes, the taste of salt mixing with the faint copper temp from his healing lip. His body screamed that it was the same as before, another round of punishment he couldn't hope to match. Yet he kept his feet moving, kept his guard high. The rhythm of punches and movement filled the clearing, a sound as constant as the beating of his own heart. Then, in the middle of that rhythm, it happened. The man leaned in with a jab, quick and controlled. The boy saw it not too late, but just in time, shifted his weight, slipped to the side, and threw his own fist forward. It wasn't wild this time, not desperate. It was sharp, compact, the kind of punch he had studied 1,000 times on his cracked phone. His knuckles met flesh with a sound different from all the glancing. blows before. Solid. Real. The man's head turned slightly with the impact. Not rocked, not stumbled, but touched cleanly in a way the boy had never managed before. The silence afterward felt heavier than the strike itself. The boy froze, his arms still extended, breath caught in his chest, as though the world had stopped moving. For a heartbeat, he wondered if it had been luck, a fluke, something the man had allowed. But then he saw it. The man straightened, lowered his gloves just an inch, and nodded once. A small gesture, almost invisible, but undeniable. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement, as plain and steady as the man himself. The boy's chest tightened, not from pain this time, but from something that felt like it might burst inside him. For all the bruises, the blood, the hunger that never left his stomach. This single moment was enough to make it real. They continued sparring, the man pressing forward again, forcing the boy to stay sharp. The punches still landed against him, still hurt, still reminded him of how far he had to go. But something had changed. He had touched the untouchable, broken through the wall he had been chasing since the first day on the cracked pavement. Each time he raised his fists again, the memory of that clean punch steadied him, anchoring his resolve in a way no speech ever could. When the spar ended, the boy leaned against the bench, chest heaving, arms limp at his sides. His body felt wrecked, but his mind replayed the sound and weight of that one punch over and over. The man walked past him, silent as ever, but his eyes lingered for just a moment longer than usual. The nod had already said what needed to be said. That night, lying on the thin mattress in his room, the boy let the day replay until sleep finally took him. He had landed one punch. Just one. But it was enough to prove to himself that he could. Once a thing is proven possible, it can be done again. It began with nothing more than a few curious glances. A jogger slowed down one morning, noticing the tall figure in a hooded sweatshirt moving in precise rhythm across the gravel with a boy far too small for the blows he was trying to throw. At first it looked like an uneven spar, the kind of scene one might mistake for a father keeping his son active. But as days passed, more eyes lingered. The heavy-set man's stance, the way his fists moved, the quiet authority in his presence. People began to realize this was not ordinary exercise. The whispers started at the edge of the park.
Ow.
Two older men at the chess tables muttered about how they recognized that face from posters plastered on old gym walls. A woman walking her dog paused long, enough to catch sight of the boy's bruised cheek and the champion's unmistakable form correcting his footwork. It was not a secret for long. The park, once indifferent to the boy's solitary struggle, became a stage where curious onlookers gathered, pretending not to watch. By the end of the week, children on bikes stopped to point. Teenagers pulled out their phones. Someone said his name aloud for the first time, and heads turned in confirmation. For the boy, the change was immediate. What had once been a private battle against hunger and exhaustion became a spectacle. His fists, once swinging in silence against air and gravel, were now measured against the gaze of strangers. Every mistake felt magnified. When he slipped clumsily, or dropped his guard too low, he could hear the muffled laughter from the benches. He had always trained with doubt whispering in his head, but now it was no longer only his voice. The neighborhood had joined in at first. He tried to ignore it. He focused on the champion's corrections, the nods and frowns that carried more weight than any outside opinion. But when he missed a step and tripped over his own shoelace, the snicker of a teenager nearby struck deeper than any punch. Face burned with embarrassment, his fists tightening in frustration. He had never asked for eyes on him. Training was supposed to be his escape, the one place where his struggle belonged to him alone. Now it was being witnessed, judged, perhaps even mocked. The champion, however, never seemed to notice the crowd. He carried on as if no one else existed, as if the boy were the only person in the park. His commands came the same as always, sharp gestures, slight tilts of his chin, the occasional clipped word. If anything, his intensity sharpened, as though the presence of others meant nothing at all. To him, the world beyond their circle of movement did not matter. But for the boy, the weight of those extra eyes pressed down with every jab. In the Evening's whispers followed him beyond the park. At the corner store, the cashiers debated whether it was really the heavyweight training him or just someone who looked similar. On the bus, he overheard kids joking about the skinny boxer being molded into something impossible. Some spoke with awe, others with skepticism, most with disbelief. The boy felt their words like stones thrown in passing. He was no longer invisible, and the exposure unsettled him. At night, lying on his thin mattress, he replayed the day's scenes in his head, not the drills or the champion's lessons, but the shifting glances, the sideways comments. A part of him wanted to retreat, to disappear back into the solitude of practicing alone with cracked gloves and empty stomach. It had been easier when no one cared enough to look. Yet another part of him, buried beneath embarrassment and fear, felt something else. If they were watching, it meant they believed something was happening. If they whispered, it meant they could not ignore him anymore. The next morning, when he laced his shoes and tied the tape around his scabbing knuckles, he carried both feelings with him. The pressure of strangers' eyes and the possibility that, for once, people might see him as more than a hungry boy shadowboxing against his own limits. As he entered the park and saw the small circle of onlookers gathering again, his stomach tightened. The champion was already waiting, expression unchanged, as if no one else had gathered at all. For a moment, the boy hesitated, fists hovering by his sides, the weight of their attention heavier than the bruises he wore. Then he stepped forward. If they were going to watch, he thought, then they would see him fight through it the way he always had. And when the champion nodded to signal the start, the boy raised his guard higher than before. It's time not only for himself, but against the crowd pressing in from every side. The champion arrived at the park earlier than usual, his hood drawn, low, but his eyes alert. The boy noticed the difference before he even reached the cracked pavement where they always met. Standing beside him was someone new, a young man, maybe a few years older than the boy, broader in the shoulders, with the posture of someone who already knew what it felt like to trade punches. His gloves weren't taped at the seams or frayed by years of wear. They were clean, functional, and fit. The boy stopped in his tracks, his stomach tightening. This wasn't training as he knew it. This was something else. The champion gave no speech, no explanation. He simply tilted his head toward the space of gravel they always used as their ring, then looked at the boy as if to say, "Step in." The boy hesitated. Until now, every drill, every correction had been one-sided, built on his rhythm against the air or the faint touch of the champion's guiding hands.
Now,
There was someone else, someone who would hit back. His fists felt heavier, his chest tighter. The other fighter stepped forward with an ease that made the boy's stomach churn. He bounced lightly on his toes, gloves tapping together in small bursts. His expression was unreadable, not mocking, not hostile, but confident in a way that felt foreign to the boy. He had no doubts. He had been here before. The champion dropped one short instruction: hold your ground. Then he stepped back, folding his arms, his eyes sharp and unblinking. The boy knew the meaning behind it. This wasn't about speed or landing clean punches. This wasn't even about winning. It was about not breaking when the pressure came. The first jab snapped toward him quicker than he expected. It wasn't a heavy blow, but enough to jolt him, enough to send his head snapping back. He staggered, arms scrambling to rise, his breath caught in his throat. He felt the hot rush of panic flood him, the instinct to backpedal, to retreat until there was nothing left but the fence behind him. Fear burned hotter than pain. He wanted to step out, to shake his head, to say he wasn't ready, but the champion's voice, calm and measured, cut through the noise. Breathe. So he did, or at least he tried. His lungs rattled against his ribs, but he forced air in. Forced his arms higher. Another jab came, heavier this time, followed by a hook that grazed his temple. His knees trembled, but somehow they didn't buckle. He stumbled sideways instead of falling. His fists didn't swing with confidence, twitched with hesitation, but they stayed up. The boy realized then what the champion meant. Fear wasn't something to erase. It was something to stand inside of. Each exchange rattled him. His ribs stung, his jaw buzzed, his arms screamed to drop. But between each strike, he heard the gravel crunching under his shoes as he shuffled, small steps keeping him upright. He wasn't fast. He wasn't skilled. He was simply still there. That became the small victory. The other fighter didn't slow, but he wasn't cruel. He pressed, tested, leaned his weight into each punch, but he didn't seek to break the boy apart. It was the champion's weight, teaching through pressure without destroying. The boy began to feel it in flashes, the space between panic and control. When he exhaled at the right moment, a punch glanced instead of landing. When he moved his feet just enough, his chest opened to breathe again. Fear stayed, but it no longer drowned him completely. The round seemed endless. By the time the champion raised his hand to stop it, the boy's shirt clung to his back with sweat. His arms felt like stones. His chest heaved as though he'd run miles uphill. He bent forward, gasping, his gloves resting against his knees. He had not landed a clean punch, not one that mattered. But he had not quit. He realized that was the point. The champion didn't offer praise. He only nodded once toward the boy, the same acknowledgement he had given when the first true punch landed days earlier. The boy understood the weight of it. This wasn't about technique yet, not about victories. This was about standing in the place where fear lived and refusing to leave, as the other fighter peeled off his gloves and walked away. The boy straightened slowly, his legs still trembling. The champion's gaze followed him, steady, unwavering. The boy's chest still burned, but within that ache, there was something else, an ember of belief, small and fragile, but alive. Fear had not disappeared, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like part of the fight, a shadow that would always be there, waiting in the corner of every round. And for the first time, the boy thought maybe he could face it again tomorrow. The night before it was meant to happen, the boy lay on the thin mattress that sagged in the middle, his hands resting on his chest, fingers grazing the faint ridges of taped knuckles. Every bruise he carried throbbed like a reminder of where he had been struck, each ache pulling him back into the weeks of drills. The mornings of hunger, the gravel biting at his knees when he fell. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the street lamp outside leaking through the torn curtain. Should have been asleep hours ago, but his body refused rest. His mind replayed everything in loops, as though afraid to forget the details that had carried him to this point. He remembered the first time he had stepped into the park with nothing but his fists and the cracked gloves he had scavenged. He could still feel the sharp sting of torn leather biting into his skin. Back then he thought he was teaching himself to fight. Now he realized he had only been shadowing an idea, chasing something he had never touched. Then came the voice. In passing, the words from a stranger under a hood telling him to keep his hands up. He hadn't known that moment would change the direction of his life. Now, lying awake, he replayed it again and again, hearing the low tone, as the weight behind it. The bruises on his ribs pulsed with every breath. They weren't just marks of pain anymore. They had become proof that he had stood in front of someone better, stronger, sharper, and he hadn't run. Proof that he had learned to stay upright when every instinct told him to fold. His jaw still ached from the last sparring session, the faint swelling a reminder of the shots that had slipped through his guard. Yet when he touched the sore line with his fingertips, he found himself almost grateful. Pain had stopped feeling like punishment. It had become the echo of lessons. He thought of the champion, silent and watchful, never softening his eyes, never giving more than a nod. At first the boy had craved words, some kind of reassurance that he wasn't failing. But now, in the stillness of his room, he realized the silence had been the answer. It had forced him to listen to himself, to hear the stubborn voice inside that kept him moving when his legs shook and his lungs begged for air. It was in that silence that hope had begun to groan, the kind that came with cheering crowds. Or promises of glory, but a quieter, steadier kind. The kind that said maybe tomorrow he wouldn't embarrass himself. Maybe tomorrow he would belong in the space he was being led into. Sleep still refused him, but his body drifted between memories. He saw himself as he had been, swinging clumsy punches at empty air. copying footwork from a cracked phone screen, mistaking effort for form. Then he saw the boy he had become ducking under a jab, stepping to the side instead of backward, breathing through the shock of fear and staying on his feet. The difference between those two boys was not something visible in muscle or size. It was carved in the way he stood now, the way he carried his fists, not as wild swings, but as tools he was learning to understand. He shifted on the mattress, the springs squealing under his weight. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, though he wasn't even sure if it still kept the right time. Tomorrow had no certainty. He didn't know if he would shine or stumble, if the ring would welcome him or expose every weakness still, clinging to his form. But as the night stretched thin and his eyelids grew heavy, he realized that fear no longer sat alone. Hope, faint but persistent, had taken its seat beside it. For the first time, the thought of stepping into the ring did not terrify him completely. When he finally closed his eyes, it wasn't the pain that lingered, but the rhythm of footsteps on gravel, a steady voice reminding him to breathe, the nod that had meant more than applause ever could. His body ached, but his heart carried something lighter, something closer to belief. The night before the ring was no longer just a night of fear, it was the night he began to believe he might actually belong. The boy stood just outside the doorway, the faint smell of sweat, leather, and chalk drifting toward him like a language he had never learned, but somehow understood. The gym wasn't hidden, just tucked between shuttered storefronts and a laundromat that buzzed with flickering neon. He had walked past it countless times before, glancing at the painted sign without ever daring to enter. Oh, he was here with the man who had once been a shadow in a park, the hood pulled low, a quiet presence that had become a guide. Ooh. The champion pushed the door open and the boy followed, every step heavy with the realization that he was walking into something different. From anything he had known, the sound struck him first. The rhythm of fists on bags, gloves thudding with steady insistence, jump ropes whipping against the floor, a bell clanging in the distance. It wasn't noise. It was music, and it carried a beat he felt in his chest. The floor was scuffed, layered with chalk dust and old sweat. The walls crowded with posters of past fights, names and faces he recognized from the cracked screen of his phone. He had studied them in silence, trying to imitate their moves in the open air. Now their images looked down at him from the peeling plaster, as if judging whether he belonged here. Eyes turned when they entered. Not all, not with open curiosity, but enough that he felt the weight of it. Fighters wrapped their hands tighter, trainers paused mid-instruction, and a few whispered. The boy knew why. It wasn't him they were looking at. It was the man walking. Just ahead, the one whose presence filled the room without words. The heavyweight champion didn't acknowledge the stares. He only moved toward an empty corner, a ring where the ropes sagged slightly and the canvas bore stains of older battles. With a tilt of his head, he gestured for the boy to follow. The first time, the boy stepped inside a real ring. The ropes pressed against his back as he ducked between them, the canvas soft and firm under his worn shoes. He looked around and saw not just a space, but a history marks of souls dragging. Faint dark patches where blood had dried and been scrubbed, corners worn by fighters who had waited for bells to send them forward. Hurt pounded, not from fear alone, but from the raw sense that this was where fists found meaning. The champion didn't speak much, didn't explain why he had brought the boy here, didn't offer promises of where this road might lead. Instead, he wrapped the boy's hands with tape, each pull firm and precise. The cloth rough against skin, still scarred from cracked gloves and gravel. The boy held his breath, aware of how deliberate every motion was, how even silence felt like instruction. When the last strip was pressed down, the champion finally looked at him and spoke only once. Now we begin. The bell rang in the distance, signaling a new round for fighters training nearby. To the boy, it sounded like something else, a summons, a beginning. He raised his hands, fists tight, shoulders trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of the moment. He wasn't fighting anyone yet, not really. The champion circled him slowly, correcting his stance with the slightest push of his shoulder, a shift of the hips. The boy moved, stiff at first, then looser, his feet learning to glide across the canvas. Every sound, the leather of gloves clashing in other rings. The grunts of sparring fighters, the barked commands of trainers merged into the rhythm that carried him forward. He threw his first punches into the air. Not wild, not desperate, but shaped by weeks of silent lessons in the park. Jab, step, breathe. The champion nodded, and that was enough. The boy felt a spark, not of triumph, but of belonging. For the first time, he wasn't shadowboxing into emptiness. The ring gave his movements weight. The ropes marked his boundaries. And the bell promised there would always be another round waiting. As sweat began to bead on his forehead, he realized that this wasn't the end of anything. It wasn't the moment he had proven himself or silenced the voices that once called him too small, too weak. It was only the first step into something larger, harder, and more unforgiving than he had ever known. And yet, with his fists raised, his body moving to the rhythm around him, he found himself ready. The silence that had once defined him was gone, replaced by the steady beat of gloves, the scrape of shoes, and the ringing of the bell that had just changed everything.